So I've got something super cool for you today on QuickSpeak English. You know what I mean? It's all about something we do every single day, but it can be really tricky in English.
Oh yeah, and this is actually one of my absolute favorite topics to talk about because, it's something that literally every English learner struggles with at some point.
Um, so we're talking about how to agree and disagree in English, like how to do it properly without sounding too harsh or uh, too passive. Peter, you've got tons of experience with this, right?
Absolutely. And the thing is, well, it's not just about knowing the words, right? It's about, understanding how to express your opinion in a way that's culturally appropriate and really gets your point across without causing any awkwardness.
That's exactly what our listeners need. Um, I mean, I keep hearing from people who say they either sound too aggressive or too unsure when they're trying to express their opinions in English.
And that's exactly why this topic is so important, Because when you're learning English, it's not just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about, and this is key, it's about connecting with people and making sure your message comes across exactly how you want it to.
So, Peter, let's start with the basics here. Like, what are some casual ways people actually show they agree with someone in English?
Oh, and this is actually really interesting because, we've got so many ways to do this in everyday conversation. First off, and this is super common, we use words like absolutely and totally all the time.
Could you give us like a real example of how that would sound?
Yeah. So like if someone says, this weather is amazing today, you might say, absolutely, or totally right. And you can even emphasize it more by adding words like 100% or completely to show you're really on board with what they're saying.
Oh, that's interesting. What about when you sort of agree, but not completely?
That's such a good point, and this is where it gets really practical. You might use phrases like, yeah, I see what you mean, or that's true, and then, well, you can add a slight qualification. And this happens all the time in natural conversation. You might say, that's true, especially in the morning.
Um, I've noticed some people just say right or exactly. Is that enough?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And and sometimes these shorter responses can be even more powerful. It's all about, and this is really important, it's all about your tone of voice. Like a strong exactly can show stronger agreement than a whole sentence sometimes.
And when you're texting, um, like how do people usually show agreement there?
And this is where it gets fun because and people do this all the time now. We use things like IKR, which means I know, right? Or even just a simple same or mood. And and these are super casual but totally normal ways to agree, especially with younger people, you know what I mean?
Um, so what about when you need to like disagree with someone? That's always kind of awkward, right?
Oh, and this is actually such an important point because, the way you disagree can really make a difference in how your message comes across. And the first thing to remember is that we often start with what I call softening phrases.
Softening phrases. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah. So these are phrases that kind of, well, cushion the disagreement. Like instead of just saying, you're wrong, which sounds really harsh, you might start with something like, I see where you're coming from, but, or, I understand your point, and
Oh, could you give us like a real example of how that would work?
absolutely. So let's say someone says, I think working from home is always more productive, and you don't agree. You might say something like, I get what you're saying about working from home, and it definitely has its benefits, but in my experience, and then share your perspective, you know what I mean?
Um, what about in more like professional situations?
Oh, that's when it gets really interesting because, and this is super important, you need to be even more diplomatic. You might say something like, I appreciate your perspective on this, and I think you make some valid points, however. Or, that's an interesting approach, though I wonder if we might also consider.
So it's all about kind of showing respect first?
Exactly. And it's not just about the words, It's about your tone, too. Like, you want to sound curious and open rather than defensive or confrontational. And another really helpful strategy is to phrase your disagreement as a question, like, have you considered? Or, what do you think about?
And I guess timing matters too.
Oh, totally. And this is something people often forget. Like, choosing the right moment and the right setting to disagree is just as important as how you say it, you know? Sometimes it's better to have these conversations in private rather than in front of others, and that shows real consideration for the other person's feelings.
So I've been wondering, like, do English speakers handle disagreements differently in different situations?
Oh my goodness, yes. And this is actually super fascinating because, the cultural context plays such a huge role in this. Like the way you disagree with your best friend is totally, totally different from how you'd handle it in, say, a business meeting.
Could you maybe give us like some specific examples?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, and this is really interesting. In casual settings with friends, English speakers tend to be much more direct, Like they might just say, "No way," or "I don't think so." And it's totally fine because there's that established relationship there.
What about in the workplace? That must be really different.
Oh, that's where it gets really, really interesting because, workplace disagreements require this whole other level of, well, finesse. And in British culture specifically, people tend to be incredibly subtle about it. Like saying, "That's quite an interesting suggestion," often actually means they completely disagree. You know what I mean?
So there's like hidden meaning sometimes?
Exactly, exactly. And this is something that can really trip up English learners because, in many cultures, being direct is seen as being honest. But in English-speaking professional environments, and this is crucial, we often, well, dance around the disagreement a bit.
What about like in academic settings?
Oh, academic settings are fascinating because, and this is really cool, they have their own sort of, well, language for disagreement. Like you might hear phrases such as, "while the evidence suggests," or "recent studies indicate." And it's all about questioning the data rather than the person. It's like this perfect balance of being direct about the facts but super polite about the delivery.
Are there any situations where being more direct is actually better?
Yes, absolutely. Like in emergency situations or when safety is concerned, being direct isn't just okay, it's actually expected. And this is really important, if someone asks for honest feedback, that's another time when being more straightforward is totally appropriate, though still with those polite cushioning phrases we talked about earlier. You know what I mean?
Speaking of mistakes, what are some common pitfalls that English learners should like watch out for?
Oh, this is such a good point. And I see these mistakes all the time. Like one of the biggest issues is, well, being too direct when disagreeing. Many English learners will just say something like, "You're wrong," and that's pretty much never okay in English.
Could you give us like a specific example of what to do instead?
Yeah, absolutely. So instead of saying, "You're wrong," you might say something like, "I see what you're saying, but," and then explain your perspective. It's all about that cushioning, you know what I mean?
What are some other common mistakes to avoid?
Oh, there are quite a few, actually. Another really, really big one is, well, agreeing too strongly when you actually disagree. Like some learners will say yes, yes, while nodding, but then completely contradict what was said. And this just creates confusion?
That's interesting. Are there any particular phrases that people should avoid?
Definitely, definitely. Like saying, "This is impossible," or "That's totally wrong," are phrases that are just, well, too harsh in English. And another thing I see a lot is people using "but" too much when disagreeing. It's better to use softer transitions like "however," or "at the same time," or even, "I see your point, although."
What about when agreeing? Are there pitfalls there too?
Oh my goodness, yes. One of the biggest ones is, well, overusing phrases like "I agree" without adding anything else. And what's really important is showing that you actually understand what you're agreeing with. Like instead of just saying "I agree," you might say, "That makes a lot of sense because," and then explain why.
Are there any cultural misunderstandings that can happen?
Oh, absolutely. And this is really, really important. Sometimes learners don't pick up on those subtle cues we use in English. Like when someone says, "That's interesting," they might actually be politely disagreeing. And another thing is timing. Jumping in too quickly with disagreement can come across as really aggressive in English-speaking cultures. You know what I mean?
Um, so Peter, if you had to give our listeners like three super practical tips to take away from today's episode, what would they be?
Oh, absolutely. First and foremost, well, it's all about practice, like start small and try these phrases we discussed in low-pressure situations, maybe with friends or even practicing in front of a mirror, right?
Second paragraph in the dialogue.
In this episode of QuickSpeak English, we're diving deep into the art of asking for help politely in English. It's something we all need to do at some point, right?
Absolutely. And it's so important to get it right. You know, a polite request can totally change the way people respond to you. It's like the difference between getting help and getting ignored, you know?
So, where do we even begin? Like, what are the key elements of a polite request?
Well, first point, using please. It seems obvious, but you'd be surprised how often it's omitted. And it makes a world of difference, you know? Then there's like using polite phrases, things like could you or would you mind. Those are much softer than just a blunt command, right?
Right. So could you help me with this is better than help me with this?
Exactly. And another thing is to explain why you need help, like giving context. If you just blurt out a request without any explanation, it can seem a bit demanding, you know? So providing context, like saying why you need the help, that shows that you respect their time and you're not just making a random demand, right?
Okay, so context is key. What about tone of voice? Is that like a big factor?
Oh, totally. Tone of voice is like super important. Even if you use all the right words, a grumpy or demanding tone will undo all the politeness, you know? Try to sound friendly and appreciative. And remember to smile. Even if it's just a phone call, your tone carries a lot of meaning.
Wow, I never thought about smiling on the phone. That's a good one. What else? What are some phrases we could use? Some examples would be really helpful.
Sure. Let's start with simple requests. For example, excuse me, could you please help me with this problem? Or would you mind lending me a hand with this? And then, you know, for more involved requests, try something like, I'm having trouble with this project, and I was wondering if you could spare some time to give me a few pointers. And remember to always thank them afterwards, regardless if they can help you or not. It's just the polite thing to do. It shows that you value their time.
That makes sense. And what about if someone can't help? How do you respond politely in that situation?
That's a great question. The thing is, well, you should always express your gratitude for their time. You could say something like, thank you so much for considering my request, even though you can't help. Or, I understand you're busy, so thanks for letting me know. And maybe even offer an alternative like, is there anyone else who might be able to assist me? It shows that you're understanding and considerate of their situation. You know?
Okay, I'm getting this, I think. So to recap, please, polite phrases, context, tone of voice, and expressing gratitude. And what about body language? Does that play a part, even if it's a phone call?
It does. Even on a phone call, you know, your posture and tone can change your entire demeanor. If you're slouching and mumbling, it will probably come across even in your tone. So stand up straight, speak clearly, and use a positive and respectful tone. And if it's an in-person request, maintaining eye contact, smiling, and using appropriate body language will certainly reinforce your politeness. It's like the whole package.
Totally. This is so helpful, Lily. I feel so much more confident about asking for help now. This has been a fantastic deep dive into asking for help politely. You know, I think we should even mention this again at the end.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like one of those skills that truly enhances your interactions and gets you further in life. You know, I wish I knew this earlier when I was younger.
Me too. I think it would have saved me from many awkward situations. You know, speaking of awkward situations, did you hear about the guy who tried to ask a magician for help, but he kept disappearing? He just kept getting the runaround.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. And it really highlights the importance of persistence, you know? Even if your first attempt doesn't work, there are always other options to pursue. Just don't be afraid to ask again and try a different approach if necessary.
That's a great point. So, to wrap up this episode of QuickSpeak English, remember the key takeaways. Use please, choose polite phrases, give context, maintain a friendly tone, express gratitude, and consider your body language even on phone calls. And if at first you don't succeed, try again.
Exactly. And Don't forget to smile, even over the phone. And thank you for listening to this episode of QuickSpeak English. Remember that practicing these techniques will make a big difference in how people react to your requests, and it'll increase your chances of receiving the help you need in a respectful and friendly manner. We hope you've enjoyed our podcast, and we'll see you next time for another insightful episode.